Greetings. Welcome to lecture number 6 of this ongoing course series on the topic of open versus closed system thinking and the broader considerations into historiography, science, and especially the queen of all sciences, economics, as far as the science of human happiness and the successful reproduction of the human species. This is a challenging topic and one which involves certain deep philosophical considerations pertaining to the one, the many, seemingly apparently opposing states of existence such as change, no change, duty, freedom, which is why I encourage the viewer, if you have not done so yet, to watch lecture number 1 and lecture number 2 earlier on in this course series that are featured in the links under this description box. So without further ado, we're going to shift gears from our studies, our probing into various lessons of universal history, and we're now going to take a step back and look at the scientific biogeochemical considerations and what this means as far as the nature of mind, matter, and the universe at large, as far as what we've learned from our recent 3 lectures, 3, 4, and 5, dealing with the clash of the two Americas, the battles to keep Canada as a geopolitical tool within a much broader global chemistry, and the higher principles of freedom and tyranny that have been expressing themselves within the contours of that battle on the stage of measurable history. So let's do a little screen share here, and we're going to begin. This particular lesson will be titled, lecture number 6. If I said 7, I do apologize. Lecture number 6, Open System Thinking with Vladimir Vernadsky. We're going to see a lot more about the figure of Vladimir Vernadsky as a person, a universal historical identity, and a great scientist whose ideas continue to reverberate and, I believe, provide a solution to many of the unsolvable crises plaguing our humanity currently. That is a painting or a photograph of Vernadsky superimposed on the backdrop of a painting or an artistic rendering of the Earth and its various magnetic fields, the Van Allen belt, and a coronal mass injection from the sun, which is being mediated by that magnetic field, the ionosphere within it, as only portions of that coronal mass ejection and the cosmic radiation from space is permitted to enter into the biosphere and the lithosphere of the Earth, featured in that image once again. That will make more sense as we proceed. Again, I'll reemphasize the concepts in this lecture to keep in the back of your mind are systems analysis, as in open, living, reasonable, and creative idea, i.e. one that combines elements of the infinite as well as the bounded, seemingly 2 opposing principles that were developed by Einstein as well, with his finite but unbounded concepts of physical space-time. We have concepts such as the one and the many, change and no change, multiply connected phase spaces that may sound scary, but it will make more sense as we proceed. Economics as science per se, that there is a genuine law of economics, but as we see in the next topic, freedom and lawfulness, it is not one which must run contrary to the necessary existence of freedom within humanity. That lawfulness and freedom, under this higher paradigm that is being explored and that we must investigate within the mind of Vernadsky, they do harmonize. So first, an introduction presently to our current world crisis once again. Featured there is a figure who has been introduced in previous lectures, but one who is playing who has played a very important role in my own research, my own development, which is why I share I'm going to share a few citations from the considerations of Mr. Lyndon LaRouche, who lived between 1922 and died in 2019, and that is him at a conference pointing in 1995 to a very specific graph that has also been introduced in lesson number 1 of our course. This is his triple curve, featured in more detail in a 2009 iteration of the curve itself, featuring 3 fundamental variables that are needed to be understood in order to both diagnose and remedy the current systemic breakdown crisis. Keeping in mind that this is a part of what he used, he came up with this in 1995 at a conference in Rome in order to help people understand his method of thinking and how he was able to forecast the inevitable systemic breakdown of the transatlantic system unless certain systemic remedial measures were acted upon quickly. Unfortunately, now nearly 30 years have gone by and no such systemic remedial actions have happened as he prescribed, especially in the transatlantic zone of Europe and North America. And now we are facing the consequences of this. So what are we looking at? This, in short, it begins as one singular system in 1971. And of course, this is highly simplified, but it does truthfully communicate the issue at hand, which on the one hand demonstrates the year-to-year destruction of the physical economic input-output, which is the measurable part of the real economy that human beings live in, that involves infrastructure, industry, science, and the means of sustaining human population. At the top are 2 curves, one meaning the financial aggregates, the other the monetary aggregates, and in short, what they represent are the purely financial aspect, the monetary aspect of the economy, which has legitimacy to the degree that it serves the blue curve. But if they become a thing unto themselves, as they were when the US dollar was floated onto the floating exchange rate previous to this floating in 1971, under the Bretton Woods principles, we had a fixed exchange rate, which made it much more difficult to speculate, to gamble on the future prices of commodities, currencies, and what have you. And to a varying degree, although it had problems, it kept the behavior of money, of investment, relatively bounded to the deeper functions of human measurable needs, such that GDP, gross domestic product, and other variables, when discussing pricing, commodities pricing, were all following certain measurable real world processes. When that connection was detached and economists began to increasingly study theories that only involved looking at futures markets, spot markets, and applying mathematical principles of gambling, derivative calculus, higher calculus functions in order to carry out transactions or guesses that would make as much investment for speculators in the present without thinking about the long-term consequences, we saw this blow up to the point that the money supply continued to increase as debts were securitized and gambled upon, increasingly as creative financial instruments such as derivatives were normalized by Alan Greenspan, activities which in the early 80s would have gotten people put in jail, like junk bond trading, as Michael Milken discovered in 1983. That became normalized as Alan Greenspan brought in these higher creative instruments that were entirely detached from real world value. And what we had seen leading up to the first major economic systemic breakdown in 2008 was a growth of derivatives from simply being $2 trillion in nominal value in 1991 to growing to the scale of $77 trillion in 1999 and up to $700 trillion in 2008 when the housing market collapsed. But of course, nothing was dealt with, and only bailouts, quantitative easing grew in pace And now we are facing 15, 17 years later as the system is even more overbloated and less capable of sustaining itself. So this is the real world crisis that we have to deal with before tragedy strikes humanity. In 2001, Mr. LaRouche, upon discovering the works of Vladimir Vernadsky, wrote a very important essay and gave several speeches to a Russian academic as well as Western audience. Um, he had been to the Duma and spoke to the Duma in the 1990s. There was a lot of very important elite alliances that were struck between the better thinkers within Russia and the United States around the necessary changes in world policy that needed to happen. However, in the West, those forces were nowhere near political power at that time, and only in Russia did he find a chord that was resonant with these ideas. So I'm going to read two quotes, two long quotes, but they will be of high use. The first, again, in November 12th, 2001, LaRouche states, "The successive Eurasia initiatives of Russia's foreign prime minister Primakov and President Putin toward Eurasia-wide cooperation for economic progress and mutual security are the setting in which I situate the proposed sense of special science mission which history has now proffered to Russia during the decades ahead. Looking towards the past, the succession of the most crucial among the shared features of the shared method expressed in leading discoveries of Mendeleev and Vernadsky offers the conception of Russian science, which best fits the role which Russia should play in a worldwide scientific progress during the decades ahead. This is a crucial aspect of the role which Russia will play in any happy outcome of the historical maelstrom which grips the planet as a whole at the present moment. I point here to what are, for me, the most crucial implications of the common thread of fundamental scientific progress, that contributed by those two great minds from the past. I speak, therefore, of the spirit of Russia from the decades presently ahead of us. On this account, we must consider the global historical setting of today's Russia, not only from the standpoint of relevant axiomatic features of the discovery and application of universal physical principles, but in terms of certain inseparable connections of ideas respecting the physical science to principled notions of social and political interest. The latter includes also the notions which govern the individual's sense of his or her mortally brief place within the continuity of those larger developments, which, respectively, have preceded his or her mortal existence and precede times to come. It is that sense of world historical identity, or the lack of that sense, which regulates the intention of the individual's role in life. Of course, Mr. LaRouche's key offering in the science of physical economy that had permitted him to make 9 successful public long-range forecasts had everything to do with his conception of the measurable interrelationship of the individual mind of somebody who makes a discovery on any amplitude which is true, and translates that discovery into qualities of new technologies that allow that society as a whole to both understand ever less imperfectly the nature of physical space-time of the universe as a whole in which we were born, as well as translate mechanically, materially, those ideas into new forms of technological progress, the effect of which is to sustain a higher quality of people at a greater quantity of people at the same time, which are able to leap outside of the former constraints that ignorance of those discoveries had imposed onto that world. That interdynamic play of the individual mind and society as a whole is the key to resolving many of those paradoxes of the one, the many, change, no change, freedom, duty, and more, illustrated at the beginning slide in my presentation. LaRouche continues in this paper, pointing to the importance of the figure of Vladimir Ivanovich Vernadsky, where he writes that Vernadsky's approach to the subject of noesis should be compared with my own application of Leibniz's anti-Kantian notion of cognition to the way in which crucial experimental proof of principle subsumes the definition of those technologies by means of which the productive powers of labor are increased in terms of a physical process per capita and per square kilometer. It is in treating the cognitive act of discovery of a universal principle as a subject of consciousness, in Vernadsky's case, as in my own, that the concept of the essential nature of the human individual, and therefore of the human species, is apprehended as a scientific conception of what should be named human nature. In Vernadsky's geology-based definition of the biosphere, a relatively weak bioenergetic force, the principle expressed as life, has been able to effect increasing power within and over what is ostensibly the providence of a more powerful force, that of abiotic principles. Similarly for him as for me, a relatively weak force of cognition is able to effect increasing power within the domain associated with what are ostensibly the relatively more powerful forces expressed as living and abiotic principles. Here lies the key to the achievement of Vernadsky relative to the earlier, more limited discoveries of Louis Pasteur and others. It was the definition of the biosphere as the outgrowth of a very long process of geological development, which provided the basis in experimental outlook for recognizing, subsequently, that principle which he termed noesis, distinguished cognitive processes from what were otherwise merely living ones. This, I think, makes a very nice preamble to everything we will now discuss pertaining to Vladimir Vernadsky, as well as the broader discoveries he made. But before we do again, back to the conceptions of solutions to our present crisis as far as a state of thinking. This is what President Putin had developed within his speech, the Global Manufacturing and Industrialization Summit of 2019, indicates something which you will not see or hear much of from a Western political figure at this moment in history, unfortunately. However, the paradigm reflects what we will be looking at as far as the political expression of these higher ideas. We're describing fusion power and the need to advance commercially viable fusion energy. Putin had said, super efficient scientific engineering and manufacturing solutions will help us establish a balance between the biosphere and the technosphere. Fusion energy, which in fact is similar to how heat and light are produced in our star, the sun, is an example of such nature-like technologies. And this concept of understanding the nature of the laws of the universe that we currently do not understand. We do not understand properly what makes the sun or any star work. We can hypothesize, but by generating fruitful discoveries, we gain mastery over those laws, and hence the universe increasingly behaves according to the knowledge that we exert over it. Hence the idea of the noosphere, or in the words that Putin has chosen to use in the speech, noosphere, becomes quite important. The noosphere being a word that was derived by Vernadsky, well, by others, but Vernadsky popularized it in an important way from the Greek concept of mind, nuos, and the sphere, like the biosphere spread as an envelope around the world, around the lithosphere, so too does the noosphere exert a similar influence and coexists with said biosphere and lithosphere, apparently expressing comparatively weaker qualities, but in fact, over the long term, representing a much greater power of transformation than any of the earlier states. Who was Vernadsky? Born in 1863, he was the founder and first president of the Ukrainian Academy of Science, and he was a leader of the Russian Academy of Science. He founded a very important institution in 1915, he led in its founding, called the Commission for the Study of Natural Productive Forces of Russia. This was a foundation, an organization which was first prescribed by Gottfried Leibniz, the great scientist statesman who we have previously been introduced to in lecture 4 of this series, and who called for the mapping out of all of the potential productive forces, the mining and other things across the vast expanse of Russia, such that those minerals and oil and other resources could be better organized and used for the benefit of both the Russians and humanity at large. This force was vital for Russia's capacities to survive even as long as it did during World War I. And it was also extremely important in carrying out the fight against Hitler later on during World War II. Vernadsky also founded the Radium Institute of Russia in 1922 after meeting and collaborating extensively with Madame Marie Curie in France, who he continued to collaborate with for the years of the 1920s until her death. He was the founder of a field called biogeochemistry after having mastered all the knowledge that one could be capable of mastering of the biological domain and the geological domain and the chemical domain. He realized that further discoveries required an intersectional unification of all three of those domains into something that would break us into new discoveries beyond the limits of what any three fields could do by themselves. And so he founded a new field of science. And through that function, he also oversaw the development of nuclear science in Russia and has been hailed as the father of Russian nuclear science. I would also add that his father and mother play important roles, I believe, in the understanding of how such a universal identity could come about. His father himself, Ivan Vasilievich, was an official special assistant to the Minister of Internal Affairs during the reign of Tsar Alexander II and III. He was a translator of the works of Henry C. Carey and other American system economists, Friedrich List being another, into Russia. He was somebody who worked hard to advance the industrialization of Russia after the freeing of the serfs, and the idea of Russia as being a modern advanced society was something his father was thoroughly devoted to as a teacher of political science. His mother was a musician and a singing teacher, and who trained Vernadsky to explore his artistic talents, which he did, and throughout his life was a poet, a musician, and a singer. I would also add, he was fortunate enough as well, as a young man, to be brought under the mentorship directly of Dmitry Mendeleev, who had recently discovered the periodic ordering, or the principle of periodicity ordering what became known as the Mendeleev table, featuring his research on the combination of various elements, how their characteristics would repeat as their atomic weight also was inclined to grow, how they crystallized, how they combined, how they were found in nature, as Mendeleev himself was somebody who explored soil and geology deeply. He was not simply a man of the blackboard. And his work also was instrumental at bringing the American system of political economy into Russia and the Russian Academy of Sciences as he rose to work with Count Sergei Witte in the 1890s, even chairing the American system inspired committee on the protective tariff that was Dmitry Mendeleev. So he was a patriot, a great universal scientist walking in the footsteps of Gottfried Leibniz, and saw a moral connection to the physical laws of the universe that expressed itself in economy, as did Benjamin Franklin and as did Leibniz and Gottfried and Vernadsky. Vasily Dokuchev was a very famous soil scientist, geologist, who was another professor of Vernadsky, who was taken under his wing and grew to appreciate the advanced science of geology. So this is what trained a young Vernadsky to become uh, increasingly a man who could unify science, arts, and economics in a very fruitful manner. Some of the works today that I will be drawing from, since we'll be reading many of Vernadsky's quotes, include his Geochemistry from 1924, his book The Biosphere of 1926, his On Fundamental Problems in Biogeochemistry 1 and 2, published in 1935, his States of Physical Space of 1938, his Some Words on the Noosphere of 1943, On the Principle of Time in Contemporary Science, an unpublished but brilliant manuscript of 1930, and Scientific Thought as a Planetary Phenomenon, published in 1932. Whether or not the human mind is natural or not has been a cause of dispute for millennia. The figures that have caused so much damage in our recent decades, I would say, do not believe that the human mind is a natural part of the universe. They are those who would call themselves neo-Malthusians, those like Henry Kissinger, Zbigniew Brzezinski, David Rockefeller, or the founders of the Club of Rome. We're trying to work very hard to revive the doctrines of Thomas Malthus, who Vernadsky despised. The idea of whether it is natural for human thought to organize nature in such a manner that desalination could be brought into, let's say, greening a desert like the Sahara, or uh, providing desalination and terraforming for the Middle East or other deserts such as the Gobi, as China is currently greening the Gobi Desert with the largest move south water diversion project in human history. Such things would be considered unnatural and wrong from somebody who believes the human mind is not a part of nature, that is, the powers of human cognition. They would see this as something which is destroying the natural equilibrium of the deserts, which desire to be dead, to not hold much life, and to simply be as they are. However, the paradox there is when we go back further enough into geological records, we find that things like the Sahara Desert thousands of years ago were in fact blossoming and green and lush in times of ancient Egypt and in times of even Babylon. The Fertile Crescent, today much desert, was known as fertile because it was a food growing region, a vast food growing expanse of the world. So, what is equilibrium? What is the natural state of nature? Perhaps nature is always changing, and perhaps even if we take enough of a step back, we might find that nature is changing in a directed orientation, such that earlier, more primitive states of nature may be found to hold less life. But as we wait, life exerts its natural quality of expressing greater powers, greater ability to go outside of its limits and expand ever more, both across the face of the globe, but also into the upper skies above and the earth penetrations below. Perhaps the human mind, which can understand and facilitate that directional orientation of deserts into green spaces and nature into more potential, might be the actual most natural thing that we could do. And just so that I don't confuse anybody, there were others who came before, during, and after Vernadsky's life who had utilized the terminology of the noosphere. I will not be referring to ideas that are in any way compatible with the language of the noosphere expressed by figures like the Jesuit priest Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, or his collaborator and fellow co-founder of transhumanism, Sir Julian Huxley, both of whom utilize terms like the noosphere, and both of whom I reject, and I believe I am correct to say that Vernadsky absolutely rejected the definitions of what the noosphere was, what even the biosphere was, from these transhumanists. Other people I do not want, who might have used a similar language, would include Gregory Bateson, J.S. Mead, um, JBS Haldane, H.G. Wells, even Alexander Oparin and Bertrand Russell might have used language that at times sounded similar to the sorts of things as far as providing a systems analysis way of evaluating the universe. However, their concepts are entirely incompatible with the notion of creativity, the noosphere, and the universe at large expressed by the likes of Vernadsky himself and his follower, Mr. LaRouche. One of those things that separates this school that I am separating from the thinking of Vernadsky and LaRouche is represented once again by the figure of Thomas Malthus, who was a functionaire for the British East India Company, generated his mathematical law of population that he invented, and or at least popularized, that gave social engineers a tool to regulate world populations based upon the concept of the arithmetic growth of agriculture and the geometric growth of population, which together formulated a geometric ratio that would result in a foreseeable point of crisis or a population collapse function where the means to sustain populations would be exceeded by the population numbers and demands and pressure itself, such that any follower of Malthus could follow his protocols for utilizing famines, war, disease that should be encouraged by the elite to keep the poor underdeveloped and more manageable. This type of dismal science was advanced and acted upon by the entirety of the British Empire for the next 2 centuries, and I would say this is what was being rehabilitated by the figures of Henry Kissinger and David Rockefeller and Prince Bernhard in the 1960s and 70s. So, Pierre de Chardin, Julian Huxley, and others who I mentioned are devoted followers of the principles of Malthus. And they also would say that, oh, we like Vernadsky, but do they really? According to Vernadsky's own words, he identified the fallacies of Malthus and absolutely separated himself and his thinking from it when he stated that Malthus doesn't realize that his fundamental results lead to entirely different conclusions. You might say that they are simply not true because he did not take into consideration the fact that estimating accurately the long-term growth of human population geologically as regards food and the necessities of life, the expansion of plants and animals comprising it must inevitably increase with greater force and speed, expressing a more rapid rate of reproduction than that of the population itself. It's necessary to always have this correction in mind. Historically, it is only the irrational elements in our social system that make it difficult to clearly observe the effect of this natural phenomenon. So, again, it's nice words that Malthus is using that might seem logically consistent on a blackboard. However, Vernadsky made the point that Malthus was absolutely wrong when we look at the measurable effect of reality and human beings' relationship to the universe. By and large, what we have seen has been when we are healthy and acting correctly, an increased rate of the powers of productivity over the rate of population growth patterns, meaning that there has always been, when acted upon correctly and not in a futile way, the power for mankind to have technology and the most important idea of the cultural dynamics outpace the growth of the quantity of people living at any given time. I mentioned that Vernadsky was the student of Mendeleev. Here's Mendeleev's periodic table. One of the important things, but like Mr. LaRouche's forecasts into future crises that he had made between 1954 and 2009, beyond those forecasts, one of the important aspects of true scientific discoveries is the power of prediction, and not just the the power of knowing the future and predicting future states, but the power that comes with that prediction, which is action, the power of acting upon those future states in ways that allow for the protection of both the biosphere and the noosphere. For example, the discovery that there are periodic droughts in a region gives one a power to act preventatively by preserving a certain amount of food so that when the drought will periodically hit, there will be no suffering and death. Um, or the idea of acting upon a dam or creating a reservoir to prevent future floodings from happening in a region that is prone to floods is another way of acting, which that insight into future states of crisis gives us. So when looking at the periodic table, one consideration that we should hold in mind and keep is that Mendeleev had had about 9 holes, or perhaps it was more, within the periodic table where he gave predictions that certain elements would be found that would have these characteristics of atomic weight, how it reacts with others, its combustibility when combined with water. And he said that even though no human being has ever experienced these elements, they will be found and they will be in these locations. And he wrote this in 1869 when he first unveiled, to great ridicule, his periodic table. However, as the years proceeded, all of those holes became filled in as Madame Curie discovered radium and polonium and other elements were discovered along the way that matched exactly Mendeleev's forecast. One thing we can see also when looking at that, and this also implies that his idea carried weight when measured according to the universe over all of the other theories that were attempting to explain the coexistence of the various atoms and their atomic states. So when thinking about this from the standpoint of human economy, going back to 9000 BC is one simple good leaping off point when the Ice Age had just come to an end. We knew and had it involved, or there's evidence, empirical evidence, that copper, gold, lead, silver, to a certain degree, iron, carbon, tin, sulfur, mercury, zinc, arsenic, and antimony had been discovered and were utilized within the human economic systems. Between 1669 and 1789, there were 15 additional elements that had been discovered and absorbed in certain ways into human function, into the human economy. An additional 34 new elements were discovered between Lavoisier's great breakthroughs in France in 1789 and 1869, bringing the total to 69. And from 1869 to the present, the full 92 regularly appearing elements had been discovered on top of the transuranics, which had been made entirely through the atomic age and human ingenuity, utilizing particle accelerators and atomic power, as well as thousands of new isotopes that are found throughout the entire periodic table. So this is taking on a much more three-dimensional characteristic, and with that, an increased power of greater productivity, sustaining more people at a higher quality of life, to the extent that in Montreal a century ago, which is near where I live, the average living span was probably about 45 years of age, and you could not hold as many people as you do today who can live on average till 80. So there is an interplay between metaphysics and physics in a specific manner. Vernadsky talks about this relationship quite a lot throughout his writings. One of those places where he talks about the noosphere was published in 1943, 2 years before his death, and while World War II was raging. And he describes how the whole of mankind put together represents an insignificant mass of the planet's matter. Its strength is derived not from its matter, but from its brain. If man understands this and does not use his brain and his work for self-destruction, an immense future is open before him in the geological history of the planet. I think that this ability to remain positive, to keep faith in the higher goodness and power of reason in mankind, despite living through a wasting periods of crisis, especially World War II, where he was writing this, is an immense, an immensely important part of Vernadsky's core identity, which I think subjectively was very much tied to his capacity to generate as many objective discoveries as he made. Now we are going to be introduced to the fundamental principles of biogeochemistry outlined by Vernadsky. Again, I will be citing from several of his published texts. Amidst all of the flux and all of the change of the biosphere and of the biogeochemical domain, there are certain things that do not change. One could perhaps call them the tensor principle developed by Bernard Riemann or Albert Einstein or Max Planck. The tensor, the thing that doesn't change amidst all of the chain, is what is going to be the focus of true science as it is understood by Vernadsky. So of those 10 principles that he discusses and places such emphasis on and challenges future scientists to hold on to and develop as the new science of biogeochemistry and the noosphere are developed, are number 1, Huygens principle; number 2, the non-existence of abiogenesis; number 3, the appearance of the golden section in living matter; number 4, light rotation, how polarized light will be inclined to rotate when in the presence of living organic substance; number 5, handedness, chirality, how certain molecules, or even in a crystalline form, will appear in a sometimes symmetrical manner when those molecules combine together, and sometimes under certain molecules will be asymmetrical. They will not be able to map onto each other. They will be kind of like gloves, which have a similarity, but you cannot put one glove onto the other. And so that attribute of the handedness or chirality of molecules is extremely important in Vernadsky's mind. The ubiquity of life, the tendency of life to yearn to go outside of its limits and expand and colonize, is another important idea that was also developed earlier by the figure of Gottfried Leibniz, as well as of Bernard Riemann. Leibniz in his principle of vis viva, a yearning for everything to become actualized in their highest and most perfect state possible without ever being able to actualize that in physical reality. That idea plays a very important role within the development of anti-Darwinian systems of evolutionary biology as well, which, as we will discover in this and future lectures, Vernadsky was a leading figure. His understanding that top-down systemic change is primary in the dance of bottom-up to top-down processes. Both coexist, but the one that leads in the dance is top-down systemic changes of the universe acting on every part. Number 8 is the increasing biogeochemical energy, which will be discussed. Corollary to number 8 is the biogenic migration of atoms, the power of recognizing that all living organisms are always going through a migration of atoms from the ambient environment through the organism, being transformed within the organism and expelled in the form of respiration, perspiration, expulsion through feces and other things back into the environment, that then reciprocates in an ongoing process, a cycle of a sense. Each individual member of a species does this, and each species has a certain way of doing this when conceptualized as a species distinct from another species. And together, all of these make up the processes that appear as stable homeostasis on the surface within a biosphere, but actually represent a much more dynamic disequilibrium. A dynamic, harmonious disequilibrium, as Vernadsky and his students describe it. And finally, I'll add a good word for Vernadsky's emphasis on the importance of the principle of cephalization, which we'll talk about. So let's break them down individually. First, the Huygens principle. On the right is a picture of Christian Huygens, a Danish scientist who was somebody who had excelled his field in optics, had worked very closely at the French Academy of Sciences, had made discoveries in the wave properties of light that were extremely useful in future discoveries. He worked closely with Gottfried Leibniz in their lifetimes, and his work on life, philosophically in the form of his Cosmotheros, published towards the end of his life, is extremely important. And in it, he observes that, or Vernadsky observes of Christian Huygens, that Christian Huygens established the scientific generalization that life is a cosmic phenomenon in some way sharply distinct from non-living matter. I recently named this generalization the Huygens principle. So some people might be confused when they see a rodent or a bug or a person or a leaf, and they think that is life. Vernadsky, following Christian Huygens, says, no, it would be wrong to say that, since life should be thought of as a principle of the universe, whereas that is the leaf, the rodent, the human, whatever, that is a particular expression in a material form and energy form of the principle of life that organizes matter in a certain way, the atoms, the molecules that make up as a sum total that particular organism. That is a material expression of the principle, but that is not the principle. If you eliminated all of the, if you blew up the world and all of the organic mass on the earth was to perish, it would be wrong in Huygens and Vernadsky's perspective to say that life has ceased to exist. It would also be wrong to assume that any volume of space anywhere within the universe could be said to be devoid of the principle of life. It is ubiquitous. It permeates as a principle all ontologically that is. And only in certain places do we find the correct heat, density, and other variables in place to allow its material expression. So, very important idea. And thus, when we look at things like the galaxies through a telescope, we have to hold in mind that these are not necessarily simply dead, lifeless forms, but might, through the expression that we could glean from the light, the heat, the geometric patterns, the golden section relationships that we could find appearing within the self-similar spiral functions of the various arms of Seyfert galaxies, we could presume that these are themselves also, in a certain way, expressions of a principle of life and not of death. This will be tackled in greater detail in our next lecture that will deal with certain fallacies within the Big Bang cosmology. Vernadsky says, instead of the concept of life, I introduced that of living matter, which now seems to be firmly established in science. Living matter is the totality of living organisms. Vernadsky added that life must be understood as a planetary phenomenon that is cosmic in nature, again reemphasizing living matter as distinct from life per se, and that life itself is a planetary phenomenon because we don't see it so much present on the sun necessarily, though maybe there will be some form of strange bacteria or extremophile. Maybe, I doubt it, but we can't say it until we do the exploration. We didn't think that we would find extremophiles within black smoker volcanoes on the bottom of the ocean surface or deep into the ionosphere, which in fact have been discovered in more recent years. So perhaps we may find evidence of life in a primordial state on the moon, on other moons, on other planets, but we know for a fact that it is a planetary phenomenon. It requires some form of planetary body to express itself in a material way, but it is cosmic in nature. On the non-existence of abiogenesis, this is an important principle, an invariant that Vernadsky discusses at length, and in his essay on some fundamental problems of biogeochemistry, he writes the connection between living and the inert substance of the biosphere is indissoluble and material within the geological time. Abiogenesis is not known in any form of its manifestation. Practically, the naturalist cannot overlook in his work this empirically precise deduction from a scientific observation of nature, even if he does not agree with it due to his religious or philosophically religious premises. So for those who believe that life can appear out of non-life, he says, no, we've never actually been able to find any example where that has truly occurred. People have come up with imaginary uh, scenarios that they imagined happened to explain how life appeared on this world where beforehand there may not have been any life in a material way. However, we have never been able to reproduce or prove that those imaginings are in any way true. And anytime that we try, we find that if life has appeared in a bacterial form in a process that we thought began with no life within a laboratory, there's always been found um, a um, a introduction of the bacteria prior, a break within a test tube, or some sort of a leak has been discovered. We have never been able to do this. And again, this is as an invariable principle, an invariant, something which transhumanists who believe in the silicon artificial intelligence uh, that will emerge in a silicon form to replace organic species of life, they refuse to even entertain this and are very offended by this notion. So this is something that Vernadsky puts forth and develops to quite a good extent. I mentioned in amongst those invariants were his golden section in living matter. Here's some examples of spiral growth functions, and we find a preponderance of, as he points out, fivefold symmetries within living matter. Whether you cause a dog or a cat or a Vitruvian man or a starfish to spread itself out, there will be a tendency towards a fivefold symmetry. We don't tend to find that in configurations of geometry where life is not present. We will find geometry in certain types of molecules of gold, of the growth of gold. We will find it in what appears to be triangles or in cubes when it comes to certain types of silicates and other types of minerals. There will be different types of shapes that will appear. However, the golden section or fivefold symmetries will not be among them. Vernadsky writes again in his Problems of Biogeochemistry, living organisms exhibit fivefold or higher than sixfold axes of symmetry. This indicates that we are not dealing here with the symmetry or the atomic structure of a homogeneous solid. The homogeneity of internal structure, which is so characteristic of crystals, is absent here. The inside of a living organism is distinctly heterogeneous, its atoms being in continuous motion, never returning to the same points where they were, unlike crystals, where the atoms do not shift for billions of years, unless external forces cause that to happen. Again, so even though we see geometry's organization within organisms, Vernadsky simply makes the point that all of the internal atomic behavior is always in a fluid state of flux, even within our bones, which appear to be solid, are in fact very fluid and vibrant over time. They're also mediated by magnetic fields, which he discusses at length in his works. Unlike crystal growth, whether it's carbon in the form of diamonds or other types of crystals, they will grow, but simply quantitatively, and the outward macro manifestation of geometries will reflect something of the internal structure of each of the individual atoms making up said diamond or said gold or whatever mineral that we are looking at crystallizing. People might think, well, what is these fivefold symmetries? What does this mean? Well, if we construct a pentagon, it is required that first the student who discovers the construction of the pentagon discover the golden section along the way. That is a necessary sub-discovery requisite for the pentagon to properly be generated if it is inscribed, for example, within a circle. And here's one of many possible constructions used, whereby the distance of C to B is to B to A, as B to A is to A to C, as A to C is to C to D. And what that creates, when you look at the long end of a star of the triangle within a pentagon to the smallest of the section in green, so we have red to green, is the golden section, which has within its middle piece what is known as phi. And that will continue to grow large or small within itself or outside of itself in conformity with the beautiful curve known as the golden section. We know that Leonardo da Vinci had done an immense amount of work with Luca Pacioli, his mathematics professor, a student and a friend of Nicholas of Cusa, and featured the study of the golden section both within the Platonic solids and especially the construction of the dodecahedron that Da Vinci illustrated in numerous ways, as well as in his Vitruvian Man, featuring an incommensurable relationship between the polygon of the square and the circle that a human being can be inscribed within. The other, number 4, invariant explored by Vernadsky was the relationship of polarized light. People say, oh, what is life? Life is just molecules that have a certain relationship to each other. And these people who think that life is simply defined as the whole of its parts, as the sum total of the parts, will have a big problem when they try to identify physically where is the life, where is the thing that causes the atoms of the rabbit to behave the way they do, knowing that those same atoms may also be found in a rock. Carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, hydrogen will be found in other non-living rocks. So what is the difference between the rabbit and the rock? Well, the first thing that the materialist or radical positivist will do is they will kill the rabbit as they begin to dissect it, looking for cause of life, not realizing that it has disappeared the moment they kill the rabbit. They will also deny the idea that there are any ways to think about investigating life per se. They will allow living matter only, but not life. Vernadsky is not so foolish. And he makes the point that one of the important characteristics of life per se, is when you measure it in the face of polarized light. This is a diagram of what is known as a polarimeter, developed in the 19th century, that takes essentially a singular plane of polarized light, which is featured there right next to the light source. And it simply allows one of those planes to proceed through it. Now there's a actual way of bringing that light now through a substance, a vial in some way that allows light to proceed through it, that features water and some other minerals within the water. And outside of that, after the light moves through that substance, it can be analyzed in another screen by a human eye featured at the right. And that eye can then judge the difference of whether or not that substance within the vial rotated the polarized light in a certain way, or if it didn't. If it did, you can even measure how much polarized light was inclined to rotate, whether towards the right or towards the left, clockwise or counterclockwise. Vernadsky writes that all proteins exhibit a left rotation of the plane of light, both in animals and in plants. This means that in the complex matter of living bodies, only left isomers in protein bodies, principal component of protoplasm, are stable. Right isomers are absent. So again, this is extremely important, and a point when he talks about isomers, he discusses a lot the work of Louis Pasteur, whose youthful work actually began not through pasteurization, but through the study of crystals and light rotation which involved the observation that there were certain isomers of molecules expressed in the form of tartaric crystals. He at the time was looking at the tartaric crystalline sodium ammonium that grew in time in wine or in the sides of wine jugs as they fermented. And he found that here's actually an image. On the right are is an image of some of these crystallized tartaric crystals that he looked at in 1849. And found that they had two characteristics. They were always the same, but some were of a right and some were of a left-handed configuration. They were almost mirror images of each other. And he, over time, separated out those that were of a left hand, those were of a right hand configuration or symmetry, and placed them in two separate piles. When they were dissolved in a liquid and placed in a polarimeter, he found something interesting. The right-handed molecules, crystals, once dissolved, would rotate the plane of light towards the right. The left-handed would rotate it towards the left. However, in their natural state of non-differentiated crystals, which would occur naturally, would grow together. If they were dissolved without having the right and the left separated, and they were all simply dissolved together, there would be no rotation of said polarized light. He also, makes the point that all life, especially amino acids, will always be taken on in living organisms as the left-handed isomer of the amino acid, whereas sugars in DNA, as it was discovered over the years, will always be the right-handed isomer of the sugar, never the left-handed equivalent. So there's something about life that we have discovered, whether we're looking at the amino acids in living organisms or the sugars used in DNA and RNA, that will always use the left or the right-hand version. Vernadsky states in The States of Physical Space that the molecular dissymmetry discovered by Louis Pasteur showed that the presence of living matter is reflected in the chemical formula, including in solutions, and that right and left-handed atomic structures are found to be non-equivalent in chemical reactions. They are chemically distinct in living matter, but chemically identical in inert chemical media. So even though quantitatively they look the same, they are not the same qualitatively. They will have different chemical reactions, the left-hand or right-handed version of various molecules. This is one simple sample of a molecule as I was describing it, featuring a variety of atoms that make up this molecule. It says here underneath a simple example of a chiral molecules of a generic amino acid. Among the many interesting examples of chiral molecules, or otherwise known as enantiomers, is carvone, which results in a spearmint aroma in one configuration, and caraway in its mirror image. So two qualitatively different tastes and smells are generated by what is quantitatively the exact same molecule. Right? So this is very important in pharmacology as a science. Vernadsky's follower and student Gauze, not Carl Friedrich, but Gauze was also somebody in Russia who advanced this and made revolutionary discoveries using especially this insight. And there's certain things that we've discovered, like aspartame as a molecule, which when taken, its isomer, its mirror image, which does not map onto it, will have a more bitter taste, I believe, is the last thing I read. It's something completely different of a characteristic, whereas the aspartame will be very sweet. There's a variety of these sorts of things that, again, have very different chemical, taste, smell reactions that are so important for true science. So this, again, says something about the nature of the universe as a whole. And, Louis Pasteur, cited by Vernadsky, hypothesized that perhaps one hypothesis to why life appeared in the way that it did on the Earth is that perhaps a a state of physical space-time was passed through by the solar system or the galaxy that induced life to make its appearance, perhaps. But that's the type of thinking that these men who are making discoveries are on that level. Number 6, the ubiquity of life. Vernadsky says in The Evolution of Species and Living Matter of 1928, the creation resulting from this evolution of new living forms adopts itself to new forms of existence, augments the ubiquity of life, and enlarges its domain. Life penetrates thus the regions of the biosphere where it had not earlier had access. Again, he's looking at, in this paper, for what are the variables showcasing that life is not growing in a random or chaotic manner, but rather in a directed way. If it is in a directed way, that new species come into being and that old species disappear, what are the variables that shape that directionality? And in this case, one of the aspects of life's quality that he observes is the ubiquity of it. All life yearns to fill a space that is beyond what it is currently capable of doing. And that every time that impulse to fill is done successfully, then what is created are new platforms of existence which will grow future potential. So this playback from potential, actualizing into itself, and then creating more potential for the colonization process of the earth to grow, whether it is in the form of bacterial, algae, photosynthesis, or higher physical forms of life like mammals or birds. As I mentioned in my description earlier on, Vernadsky on top-down systemic change is primary in the dance between bottom-up and top-down changing variables. Of course, every part plays into the topography of the whole, but the whole also plays down and shapes every aspect of the parts that make up the universe as a whole. Vernadsky emphasizes that each upshift from one lower system to a higher system in evolutionary time occurs as a change within the system as a whole, and never within the bottom-up accumulation of units of particular species or individuals fighting for survival in a closed system of diminishing returns, as we find in the Darwinist worldview. This will be developed in a greater degree in a future lecture on the fallacies of Darwinian biology. So I'm not going to say too much about that yet, but Vernadsky does look at what is the creative process, what brings new species into being, and he notes that it's the system as a whole which changes, not simply individuals fighting with each other for diminishing returns, as a Darwinian might be inclined to suppose. And also keep in mind that radical Darwinians, including obviously Darwin himself, deny directionality a priori. They also deny any type of moral consideration of better or worse when conceptualizing the changing of living organisms in time, in evolutionary time. Those are not burdens or axioms which Vernadsky holds to his heart. Number 8 is the increasing biogeochemical energy of the system, where he writes in Problems of Biogeochemistry, the basic distinctive feature of biogeochemical energy is clearly and forcefully demonstrated in the increase of the free energy of the biosphere over the course of geological time. Again, as the biosphere advances, even before there was humans, in Vernadsky's considerations, there is evidence that the free energy, the capacity for the living matter itself to generate more energy than is required to sustain the system as a whole, is increasing before there were even humans. He is saying that there's evidence that this function was already determining the flow of life itself, indicating once again what higher, wise human policy making and considerations when planning for the future should take into consideration if we are going to move in harmony with nature's law. quick example of biogeochemical energy processes and are involved the basic cycles of the biosphere. His book from 1926 on called The Biosphere did more than any other work at defining how to properly think about the nature of the systems of life on the Earth. Obviously, here in this cartoon, there are several functions being generated featuring the evaporation of water through the heat caused by the sun from oceans and lakes that form into condensation of H2O, which itself then rains down into the green mass, generating and providing for more chlorophyll, more photosynthesis that relies again on the sun being a very important driver for all of this to work. The water then moving back through its hydrological cycle. But not only that, the heat and also mineral exchanges are being driven by internal geological processes of water seeping down into the earth and being brought back from deep within the earth back into the water systems. There's a reciprocity there, which is very difficult to observe, but it is real. We have volcanoes and we have other forms of minerals excreted from the crust of the earth into water, as well as through volcanoes in the form of eruptions. And we've got tectonic activity and a variety of other processes that we have still yet to largely explore within the Earth itself. And the fundamental feature of life, in one other way to think about it, is that all life can be seen as having needing to consume and will produce. Like a human economy involves consumption and production, change of raw materials, seeds that then get transformed into useful goods that are used, and that we consume in food, that we use in other ways, that are then sent back in the form of garbage or excretion or other things in a human economy. That same thing is something we find visible all over life, even before there was humankind, in the form of energy consumption, the transformation of that energy within organisms, the transformation out of that energy, the expulsion of that energy in other forms, chemical and energetic, biomagnetic and others, the replication of individuals in the form either of amoebas that go through mitosis that can self-replicate, or in the forms of cells, or in the forms of larger organisms that procreate. Again, the products, the waste biomaterial, mineral activity provides for the basis of usefulness, where soil is not a dead thing, but is composed, is created by a vast overturn of living organisms, bacteria, plants, and other things dying, decaying, being a part of the living process again. And this is just something which occurs and can be thought about on the atomic level, as well as the molecular level and the electromagnetic level at the same time. Another imagery which Vernadsky uses quite a lot within his writings, including in his biosphere, but all the way up through his works on fundamental problems of biogeochemistry. He describes here how one could choose to understand each organism as likened to a whirlpool, where he writes, under the biogenic migration of atoms, that biogenic migration not only depends on the quantity of atoms caught by it at every moment in the biosphere, but also on the rapidity of their movement, the number of atoms passing through living matter in a unit of time, or on the displacement in this same unit of time evoked by an intervention of a technological order by living matter within the ambient environment. The biogenic migration of chemical elements in the biosphere tends towards its most complete manifestation. So just as a whirlpool is constantly absorbing, taking in elements from the ocean or from the water system that it is moving in and expelling it, we can be thought, every organism can be thought like that, except the organism is also transforming and not just simply quantitatively moving things through itself. And on top of that, more advanced organisms or less advanced can be an index, let's say, can be created, as he challenges future biologists and zoologists to do this, is to create an index of the relative averages of the biogenic migration of atoms, the throughput of atoms. What are those atoms? Under what proportions are they? In the course of an hour, a day, a month, how do they cycle through different organisms? So, can we create sort of an encyclopedia as such that codifies the averages of all of the organisms so that we could see them in that way if we so chose to, right? And then we can better understand, looking at evolutionary time, what are those variables that are at play as certain species appear, or that certain species which appear and are negligible might become dominant after a mass extinction cycle. Why do they come out to dominate while other species disappear? Perhaps this type of variable will help us understand this. Because he says, and we're going to see more of this, that this is one of the most important distinguishing features that demonstrates why life in the universe are open and anti-entropic. That'll come out even more in the next lecture. And cynical pessimists might look at the destruction of the 99.9% of species that we know have existed through the fossil records, which no longer exist, which are extinct. And cynics might say, oh, that's proof that destruction is dominant in life, or that if we want creativity, destruction is necessary. There are certain political considerations throughout history which have resulted in many wars, much depopulation, and much suffering because of these fallacies, these Manichaean fallacies of logic. However, somebody like a Vernadsky, though he didn't know of this degree of detail as we've come to discover in the years after he died, would look at the rates of growth of new species and the destruction of species which occur in the course of the last 540 million years, since approximately the Precambrian period. And we would note that what is dominant here, although destruction does occur a lot, what is dominant is a higher function of growth. It is not like things simply return back to zero. And in recent years, there have been teams of scientists who have discovered, utilizing Fourier analysis, that there are periodic big extinction cycles. Every 32 million years, there has been one important repetition of a extinction process that occurs separated by foreseeable amounts of time. There's a longer wave of another extinction cycle that is also tied into this. I believe it's 120 million years approximately. Some factors at play involve ice ages, but not all of them. Some of the factors involve the shifting of the magnetic poles, but not all of them. Other factors might involve volcanism and earthquake activity, but not all of them. And I would say many of them are driven by asteroids, that at certain periodic moments within our solar system, we find the harmonic distribution of the orbits, including the asteroid belts of Ceres, of the asteroid belt between Saturn and Mars, gets dislodged through various disharmonies, resulting in a greater tendency of asteroids to slam into other planetary bodies, of which the Earth is one of. So when discussing and considering a Vernadskyan way of thinking about systems evolutionarily changing, we do not see gradualism. One of the variables pulled together by LaRouche Pack, or I think they've changed their name to Prometheus Pack, has been featured here when looking at the overall how many animals existed as we go deeper back into fossil time, going back past the Cenozoic, the Mesozoic, the Paleozoic, nearly 480 million years ago. We find that there are not gradualist, slow changes as a Darwinian would expect. A Darwinian always presumes gradualist changes, but instead we find not only punctuated changes of species disappearing and new systems coming into being very quickly, but that the ratio of animals with higher metabolic rates when compared to those with lower metabolic rates is increasing in favor of those animals representing higher metabolic rates. force thinking about, for example, the amount of food is needed for a mammal to maintain its metabolism, its heat, to turn that food into energy, right? In order for the basic functions of its organs, for its behavior, its ability to adapt within the environment that allows it to move and thrive, to move faster, is much greater than, let's say, a lizard, which needs less food, less biomass to be eaten. However, the metabolic power is substantially lower than that of a mammal. And as such, as well, we find that the lizard's capacity to adapt, to regulate in a colder environment is reduced. A mammal will survive much better and thrive within colder, hostile environments. So that adaptability, that power of transforming energy into matter into energy is an extremely important consideration, especially considering that mammals were a relatively newer being that appeared onto the scene, whereas lizards would have been here much longer, and other lower metabolic beings would have been here even longer than lizards. Here's a quick example, without going into too much detail, of a dominant species we find in the fossil records of the Paleozoic, known as articulated brachiopods. It's a sort of shell-like oyster, and it has a cousin in the form of bivalve mollusks. The interesting thing here, that I think is a representative of a broader principle, is that they feature the same predators in nature. They eat similar things. They excrete similar byproducts. And as similar as they are, the bivalve mollusk has a metabolic rate which is approximately 10 times higher that of the articulated brachiopod. It must eat about 10 times more than the volume of food which an articulated brachiopod must eat. Both of them have continued to exist across the ages. However, we find that at the mass extinction cycle separating the Paleozoic from the Mesozoic, that something happened whereby the articulated brachiopod collapsed in its overall population levels drastically, and that stayed extremely low relative to the bivalve mollusks, who continued to grow and even seem to have benefited by the changes that seem to have happened in the physical space-time shaping the Earth at that moment. What was it? How was that? These are all questions for the future, but they must be posed. And finally, the last variable here is cephalization. Vernadsky writes in the biosphere and the noosphere of his studies of James Dwight Dana and Joseph LeConte, two important American geologists. And he writes, the younger contemporaries of Darwin, James Dwight Dana and Joseph LeConte, both great American geologists, and Dana, a mineralogist and biologist as well, expounded even prior to 1859, which is the date that Darwin published The Origin of Species, the empirical generalization that the evolution of living matter is proceeding in a definite direction. This phenomenon was called by Dana cephalization, and by LeConte the Psychozoic era. In other works, Vernadsky does take direct concrete aim on Darwin's fallacies. Again, for those who try to impose a Darwinian system onto Vernadsky, fail when you look at Vernadsky's actual writings and thinking. It's only for those who don't study Vernadsky that they are led to be fooled by those who would lie and say that Vernadsky was a follower of Darwin or a follower of Malthus, as, again, many unfortunate among transhumanists and their followers today have been led to believe. So what was this principle of directionality developed by, in this case, James Dwight Dana, of cephalization? Well, that's a painting of James Dwight Dana, and again, a contemporary of Darwin who had a lot of trouble with some of the axioms and of assumptions embedded within the Darwinian system. And he looked at various species, fish, amphibian, reptile like the alligator pictured there, the bird, a goose, and a mammal, horse or another higher mammal, and looked at their nervous system and found that in time, as we looked at more and more advanced species that would have appeared in time later on than the older species, we find that there is a tendency of the nervous system to centralize in the form of a brain. And in time, with humans especially, or even more primitive apes, there is a tendency to utilize more and more the arms for transport instead of for transportation, but for being an appendage of the mind and of intention of the brain. Not to say that the brain and the mind are the same thing. They are not the same thing in the same way that life and living matter are not the same thing. I would say the same logic applies for the mind and the brain. And Dana understood this. But there is a physiological tendency towards greater centralization in the form of a nervous system and a capacity, as in the case of human beings, to begin to walk fully bipedal and to begin to look at the stars, as Plato develops in his Timaeus earlier, as what distinguishes human beings from other animals is the capacity to look at the stars and to wonder in awe what are the causes of the heavens. So this is very important, again, this cephalization concept for Vernadsky, and as it is for all great scientists, several of whom we will meet later. Vernadsky makes a high priority on the quality of plasma. There's the fourth state of matter, liquid, solid, gas, and eventually plasma. All matter can be expressed in all four of those states. Plasma being that state which involves electrons falling off of nuclei, resulting in positive charged atoms in form of a gas state that becomes magnetically charged, and we find in the ionosphere as a plasma. And in fact, the vast majority of the universe can be said to be made up of some or another form of plasma. Vernadsky looks at fire as a primitive state of plasma and describes what this says about the human mind, unique all other species, wolf, monkey, rat, everything. Where the oligarch, where a Malthusian will look to other species of wolf as a lesson, or monkey, and they will use those rules of the jungle as a lesson to try to superimpose into the management of human society. Vernadsky and all people who think on that higher level will do the opposite. They will look for how are we similar, but more importantly for the organization of human law, how are we different? What makes us unique? And fire has been one of the clearest examples where every other species, when they see fire, will run away, whereas humans alone will move towards in curiosity and will learn how to harness the use of fire. And in knowledge of utilizing fire, as Prometheus had stolen fire from Zeus to share it with humankind, it was a greater power to live longer, to cook food, to preserve food, to stay warmer, to move into territories that would otherwise be hostile, right? There's so much more power that we have over nature through the knowledge that comes with responsibility, moral, and utilitarian alike. And Vernadsky writes in Scientific Thought as a Planetary Phenomenon, the discovery of fire presents the first instance in which a living organism takes possession of and masters one of the forces of nature. Undoubtedly, this discovery lies, as we now see, at the foundation of mankind's subsequent future increase and our present powers. So much like LaRue, who places a lot of emphasis in his Science of Physical Economy on the power of human cognition of the noosphere to discover better forms of fire. As we discover, for example, how to burn wood, there's always a limit that is imposed upon our species, since there's only so much wood to be used at any given time. So that if we don't make a newer discovery, those limits to growth defining our carrying capacity will be absolute, will cause wars, will cause scarcity, will cause despair, and the rules of Malthus will then appear to be true. However, when we're making a discovery into coal as something that can be burned, we find that burning, that higher form of fire that we get from coal, releases much greater energy with much less volume. So less coal than wood can get the same amount of energy, and the same amount of heat. And there's still only a limited amount of coal that we can acquire at any given time. So unless we figure out how to produce coke, which burns even more than coal at a higher quality, longer with less of it, then we're going to be constrained by the same rules that Malthus talked about that will cause us to have a population collapse and war. Unless we discover oil, which was once treated like a pollution or a black ooze, which farmers did not wish to see on their property, until some ingenious minds realized that it is combustible and that by applying that quality of heat through that energy source, less oil can give out greater heat than that same quantity of coal. There would be more coal volume wise needed to get to give off the same amount of energy that you could from oil, right? Or compare that to natural gas, or as Vernadsky led as a pioneer of the atomic science, of atomic energies, right? Which only a fraction of a microscopic amount of uranium or thorium will generate the heat and a longevity and quality and energy flux density that will be even better than a very large amount, many hundreds of barrels of oil, or thousands of tons of coal, or even millions of tons of wood. And then compare uranium, for example, to helium-3 or deuterium that would be needed to generate as minerals or isotopes the type of process that we would expect to see in fusion power, which would require a microscope of even the amount or microscopic portion of the volume you would expect to see of uranium that would give off more heat at a higher heat. So better and better organization of fire. That fire is the key that generates the interrelationship of individual genius to the species as a whole, that moderates through our existence to the universe and to God as a whole, if you wish to take it to its logical conclusion. So to redefine, I will now recapitulate the core thesis: the lithosphere, biosphere, and noosphere. Vernadsky makes the point, as a true scientist, if you wish to be a true scientist, you have to take all three of those states into your mind at the same time, and you must appreciate nature as a coexistence of the three phase spaces that coexist, where you have atoms organized in non-biotic nature, which is the lithosphere or abiosphere, which is atoms effectively like a rock, right, that are not animated directly by the principle of life, or in a crystal. Then you have atoms organized in biotic nature, biosphere. So the carbon in a plant or the carbon in a charcoal will still be carbon. Mathematically, geometrically, it will be carbon. But the role it plays will be different. The cycles it experiences, what it interfaces with, will be vastly different in the living biosphere domain as compared to the lithosphere. Lithos being a Greek word derivative of rock. And then atoms organized by human thought. Essentially everything around you in the room that you're sitting on listening to my presentation, look around and try to find anything which is not noetic, the noosphere. Every piece of paper, this post-it pad, the electricity in the microphone, are all the effect of countless discoveries, in some cases of people whose names endure, in other cases whose names may have been forgotten, but whose presence, whose substance of life lives on through the accumulation of discoveries. The ink organized in the books, printing presses, the invisible accumulation of human thoughts, of souls that existed, that used their time in the flesh well, that shared their knowledge, their knowledge while they were alive, and that continued to reverberate into infinity. That is the noosphere. and it is something which has no absolute limits to it. It is something which can understand the invisible but very real geometries of the magnetic fields of our planetary system, of the magnetic field of the sun, which flips every 11 years. That was discovered somewhat recently in conjunction with the sunspot and coronal mass ejections. With the changing intensity of the sun's magnetic field, which can at different times grow in power and size, expanding a bigger portion of the solar system as a system, and at other times retracting into a smaller, weaker part of the system, we find that the magnetic field of the Earth, which also oscillates and harmonizes, almost breathes and grows and pulsates, is also something which is regulating the cosmic radiation from the entirety of the universe, from galaxies and nebula, that will sometimes penetrate deeper into the solar system, which when the sun is stronger and the magnetic field stronger, they will not penetrate as deeply into the inner part of the solar system. When it gets weaker, they will. And the aurora borealis that we see in the poles of the Earth will increase. Flux of those cosmic rays will embed themselves into the geology, deep into the core of the Earth even. Some of it will be transformed and be released back out from the Earth, and each planet will be seen as a transformer. And some of that will pass through the biosphere. How does that affect the mutations in time? How does that affect what we think of when we think of bacteria or whatever we think a virus may or may not be? How does that affect the flow of cellular change? And is it possible that this is not chaotic? That this is organized by harmonic patterns, by processes that are rational, reasonable, discoverable, and thus processes that we can act upon? Over time, we know that that life itself, as Vernadsky describes within his biosphere, generated increasing complex atmospheres, stratospheres, as more free oxygen was released into the ozone layer, which is the product of oxygen being generated. At one time early on, oxygen was a deadly thing. There was an oxygen crisis that played a role in one of the big mass extinction cycles a long time ago. And we know that over time, life generated new properties within itself, within things like chlorophyll, that is a new molecule with new attributes, was able to begin utilizing oxygen in ways that previous states of life could not do. And combined with solar energy, was able to utilize both oxygen and carbon dioxide. It could break up carbon dioxide within, utilize some of the carbon, right? Create certain things like more free oxygen could be broken up from the carbon dioxide, and that could be then released. That could feed back into the growing ozone layer. The ozone layer was very important, as we discovered, at cutting out very dangerous ultraviolet light. And that ultraviolet light, as it became more subdued, higher life could thrive outside of the water on the surface of the Earth. And so we have this intricate playback. And Vernadsky points out at the very first chapter of his biosphere that there are something to the effect of 40 known octaves of the electromagnetic field, an octave being a doubling of a frequency. 40 known octaves of the electromagnetic field can be found within the knowable, measurable energies from the gamma rays all the way down to the long radio waves. But of those, only approximately 9 or 10, he says, actually penetrate through to the surface of the Earth. The optical part being a very small part. This is just some examples of those that get through. And he says, living matter is the bearer for and creator of free energy, not existing to such degree in any one of the Earth's envelopes. This free energy, biogeochemical energy, embraces the entire biosphere and fundamentally determines its entire history. So the entire biosphere is one thing. He describes it in further. The free energy stimulates and radically transforms the intensity of the migration of the chemical elements which compose the biosphere and determine its geological significance. So, whether it's again phosphorus, which is expelled by birds that all of a sudden plays a role in biospheric activity, or whether it's the growth of bones in exoskeletons and then mammalian and reptilian skeletons, which utilizes calcium in new innovative ways that also have an electromagnetic signature. All of this plays back into the creation of calcium deposits. Things like iron ore, even, and deposits that we mine from the earth. Much of this can be conceptualized as the slow uh, death of iron-bearing bacteria that accumulated in a certain area or another more than you would expect, and find things like the Saugus Ironworks of Massachusetts as one place where there was a massive mining potential because of the slow decay of iron-bearing bacteria. Then calcium and other things. Each living thing is affected by the environment, but also affects in turn the environment. This is a very important interplay. It's not one or the other entirely. And again, we already saw the big five extinctions, but I wanted to show this again after what's been said. There's always more free energy being introduced into the system that feeds back into greater growth, greater quality, leading up to mankind, human beings. And Vernadsky writes a lot about human beings as he breaks through to the new science of the noosphere, where he writes, a new riddle has arisen before us. Thought is not a form of energy. How then can it change material processes? So that is a very good paradox everyone should hold on to. Ideas themselves don't exist in a physical location. It is not thus a form of energy the way we could consider uranium or oil to be fuels that express a type of energy. Mind is not that. Ideas are not that. But yet, ideas change material processes. Ideas even of justice change material processes. With man, the form of biogeochemical energy connected to reason grows and expands with time, rapidly moving to the fore. This increase is possibly related to the growth of reason itself, a process which seems to occur very slowly, if at all, but is chiefly connected to its honing and deepening in using it to consciously transform the social environment, and is especially due to the growth of scientific knowledge. I think he's taking a little bit of a cynical jab, writing this in the midst of World War II, that it occurs very slowly, if at all. But he does believe it does grow. And the growth of reason, the accumulation of discoveries, a power of understanding, comes with it great responsibility. Because understanding comes with power. Power to change ourselves and to change nature in a way which is in accord with natural law, comes with the responsibility to be moral, to abide by the conscience, right? The quality of the soul that demands to be healthy, that demands that a moral virtue be expressed, and a dignity in every individual sovereign person must be expressed for that responsibility, for that power to be manifest properly. Otherwise, we could see a society turn into a tyranny, uses technology to suppress and oppress and destroy, instead of a society which recognizes that technology is merely the material manifestation of mankind's relationship to God. If that slight shift will determine whether we create a hell or a heaven on earth. And just some examples of the noosphere. Some people might be purists and say, but I don't believe in that. That sounds too unnatural. This idea that the human mind must always increase free energy and progress. And that reason is somehow going to be a determining factor of my life. Not my life. That sounds like a tyranny. I could imagine some anarchists or hippies screaming today. But I would just say you can't. You're born into it. The world already is been transformed radically in a beautiful way by the process of reason. And just some examples of things that did not occur naturally, if devoid of human thought, are here presented on the screen. On the left is teosinte, on the three types of corn. On the left is a proto corn that is called in Mexico teosinte. It is the ancestor of modern delicious corn. It is unedible. Over time, human beings chose the best of the corn seeds that were then bred into better and more edible corn, to the point that we have achieved today a very delicious, voluptuous corn, which has a lot of biomass that can be turned into energy for the sake of carrying out the functions of our body and our lives. The animals that we spend our time watching on YouTube doing funny videos, whether kitty cats or whether animals from a farm, cows and horses and sheep and chickens and donkeys, don't appear in nature that way. Their existence as species are the product of human thought, selecting and judging the best, most useful, compared to their counterparts that are wild in nature. Especially look at wild cows. You know, they're beasts, these buffalo. And if you try to release a cow or a chicken or a lamb into nature because you feel bad that it's being confined in a farm, I'm sorry, you won't have to wait long before it gets destroyed by nature. It no longer, its species character is fundamentally different. And the very fruits we eat, all of those fruits are things that exist purely because of human thought deciding to select amongst those sour, bitter little berries something that tastes better. And over centuries and millennia, we have the modern grapes and pomegranates and strawberries. The deserts themselves is an example of Saudi Arabia, but the deserts we know that were once lush thousands of years ago. The Sahara was a lush, vibrant place. There's enough fossil and other evidence to show that. But for whatever reason, geologically speaking, that fresh water went underground, deep underground, although it is still there in underground aquifers. At some point, it is likely that it will appear back on the surface naturally, perhaps in thousands of years. But we know that human thought, and sometimes human thoughts make mistakes. They make too much change too quickly without understanding what they're dealing with, resulting in desertification and other crises. However, thought is a powerful thing. And by tapping into some of that underground water, we've found that in the Middle East, vast food growing regions have been able to be created. Of course, those aquifers are not going to be there forever. They require to be replenished. Other new technologies must be discovered in order to replenish and to bring more water into sustaining and improving upon that qualitative change. Will it be nuclear desalination? Perhaps. Will it be water diversion? Perhaps. Will it be ionospheric manipulation of the ionosphere, which could possibly cause some of the natural vapor rivers that always circulate above the surface of the earth to rain over land instead of over the Mediterranean or over the oceans? Perhaps it might be all elements of all three. But we know that this is the noosphere in action. An optimistic image made by an old friend of mine, Chance McGee, who worked with the Schiller Institute some years ago, I think is beautiful, featuring a replenished Lake Chad on the right. And if things are done with human thought and intention and knowledge of the universe properly that we are abiding by, we could easily see railroads and new cities, as is currently being advanced by the Africa Agenda 2063 program, supported by Russia and China, that could extend rail lines across Africa as a continent, which could replenish Lake Chad, around which new cities would be created. Not to the destruction of nature. There's no reason why we have to assume that nature will be destroyed. But you could see the greening of the Sahara Desert. You could see a lot of amazing balance between technology, human life, and ecosystems at the same time, including we have what's already being built with the Trans-Arabian high-speed railway in Saudi Arabia to the UAE. Fusion power, as Vladimir Putin alluded to its importance as a natural process of creative change within the universe that animates each star to some degree, including our sun. And that's an image of a plasma within a tokamak reactor, which is just one of many ways to begin to develop fusion processes. This is also involving the use of electromagnetism at certain um, frequencies. There's ways to also develop stellarators, to develop V-pinch technologies that could use the natural flow of those plasmas to find least action pathways, whereby less energy might be used to get much bigger effects than one could typically get by perhaps smashing a particle or simply increasing the heat so that we create fusion. There's many ways to achieve fusion, and we need to open up the door, as China and I hope Russia will be more inclined to do soon. Finally, when looking at the future, in 1943, Vernadsky wrote, "Still the war was raging, but noting of the emergence of the age of the noosphere, saying that now we live in the period of a new geological evolutionary change in the biosphere. We are entering the noosphere. This new elemental geological process is taking place at a stormy time, in the epoch of a destructive world war. But the important fact is that our democratic ideals are in tune with the elemental geological processes, with the law of nature, and with the noosphere. Therefore, we may face the future with confidence. It is in our hands. We will not let it go." In the next lecture, we will discuss anti-entropy as a fundamental principle of physical space-time. We will look at the holes in Big Bang cosmology. We will evaluate Alexander Gurvich's electromagnetic embryology and his broader ideas of morphogenetic fields, and especially ultra-weak photon emissions of life or in living matter. We will look at Halton Arp, the astronomer, the student of, the astronomer Halton Arp and his work on intrinsic redshifts, understanding redshifts as not Doppler effect, but rather intrinsic redshifts or blue shifts, indicating something very different from simply distance and speed from a point of observation. And obviously, the harmonics in the microcosm and macrocosm will be explored implicitly. So, without further ado, I thank you so much for taking the time with me today to go through an exploration into a great mind, Vladimir Vernadsky, and I look forward to our next lecture, number 7.